The last 500 years would have been different if, when the translators of the King James Version were doing their translation, their update of Tyndale's translation, they had used the word that Tyndale first used in the early 1500s when he came across the Greek word ecclesia, where he used the word congregation. But to sort of keep the authority of the institution, they had instructions that they had to use the word church. And so we've sort of had this problem, not so much of confusing church with the building, but still having this institutional out there idea of church, and not always recognising that it's better for us to read the word congregation, or even read the word us, we, when we're involved. And so last week I began a series which will take a break over Easter to look at some of the metaphors, the figures of speech, the way the Bible talks about us as the church. And last week I talked about being sheep, and I said that was a picture of, us all heading off to church, or being the church in the morning. Talked about the lessons we can learn from that metaphor of listening for and hearing the shepherd's voice. Important to me, and something I hope I'm able to convey over my ministry here, is the importance and the difference of being drawn to follow, not driven. And I shared that as we unfold some of these, there is the issue that there's a responsibility involved in being the church. And so this week I want to look at the idea of the church as family. And I've already said one of the two words that is translated church is ecclesia, if you like, the gathered congregation in a particular place. But there's another Greek word, or a couple of Greek words, adelphatos and oikos, which are translated in different ways as the family of believers. Or you might have, in the really old, less, egalitarian way of translating the Bible. You might have talked about the brotherhood of believers. But it's really the family, those who are part of this organism that God has built together. And there's a couple of verses up there, one from the letter that Peter wrote, love the family of believers, and one from Galatians, we have opportunity, let's do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. We understand that we are a family of believers because we are all children of God. In John's Gospel, to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. It's not about an ethnic race. It's not about blood ties. It's about the decision of God to call back to himself those that he has made for relationship with himself. And as we are called, we are children of God. And we are called to be this not just as a child of God, an individual who would come to God on our own, even though, yes, it does have this idea of having a personal dimension for us, but it's not a private thing. We're not intended to be a private thing in the sense of happening disconnected with others. In fact, as a human life, you really only come into being because other humans had a relationship. It may or may not have been a good relationship, but the intention of God is that he would set people into families because he doesn't want us to be alone, because he doesn't want us to be lonely. In fact, we know that it's not natural for a baby to be on its own. We're watching some, documentaries again recently where you see these babies often, just get left, depending on, what sort of a baby they are. But, often, off they go. The parents leave the egg and it hatches and they're on their own and they've got to find their way across, the beach and out miles into the ocean to have a life and so on. But human babies aren't like that. In fact, if you found a human baby stuck on its own somewhere without people around, you'd be a little bit concerned. In fact, a crying infant found alone in a shopping mall would be considered a lost child. There'd be announcements made over the PA trying to find his or her family. And in the meanwhile, others would care for and comfort the child. Yet we live in an age that stresses individuality. And because of that, we can sometimes be at risk of making the unnatural common. But God declares that it's not good for people to be alone. And so part of our being made in God's image is that, like God, who is three in one, relationship, community, interaction and love are part of our very being. In fact, being alone has often been seen as a punishment, that of solitary confinement. I don't know whether you've ever been to Tasmania and been to Port Arthur, but in Tasmania, at the Port Arthur penal settlement, they have, this chapel is a picture of the chapel down there, which would suit well our modern day individualistic way of doing things, where each one has its own little door to come in and its own little seat and has this, baffle to keep those other annoying people out. And everyone can see the preacher, because of course the preacher is the most important part of any church service. And they're all gathered together in the one place, aren't they? But if they're all in that kind of solitary aloneness, disconnected, it's not the way it was intended. The contrast to that is inclusion. How great is the love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. Got a quote from Martin Lloyd-Jones, who, depending how long you've been around, you may or may not have heard him quoted before. He well known for spending, 7 years preaching through Romans. I still don't think he quite finished. But he had some interesting things to say, and he talks about the Christian life. And the ultimate object of salvation is not to keep us from hell, not merely to deliver us from sins. It is that we may enjoy adoption, that we would become the children of God and co-heirs, joint heirs with Christ. The highest good is to see God, while in this life to know him intimately as our Father and to cry, Abba. God forbid that any of us should stop at any point short of that. But some of that will be more for another day. I'll talk about being co-heirs, about being co-workers. And today also is not principally really going to be about the love of God the Father for us, or the benefits for us of being his children, but I want to talk about some of the challenges of being a family, the cost of fellowship, if you like. Being family can be hard. There are many dysfunctional families, is the word we use these days, and church often can be one of the most dysfunctional of families. Doing life together poses a problem because relationships can be hard. The answer is not to toss it out, but to seek to find how God would want us to restore and be a healthy church family. But we need to overcome a few things that make it a problem for us. I mean, one of the things that makes being a family harder than just living our own personal life of private faith and devotion is that when we mix with other people, we rub up against one another. We expose ourselves to these things: disappointment, resentment, selfishness, and pride. All of which really sort of happen when we are comparing ourselves with or interacting with others. And these things cause a brokenness in all relationships, but they're the same things that cause a brokenness in a church family. But fortunately, God doesn't leave us to muddle on. He gives us what we need for life and godliness. To counter those relationship killers, he urges us to foster these things: humility, forgiveness, selflessness, and devotion. But the thing is, they don't come cheap. Each one costs us. Just in terms of, some things, and often people might find if the cost's too high that it's easier to go out and get another one. It's, a joke, but it's not a joke because it's so true. But, printers. I looked online this morning, you can buy a particular printer at Good Guys for $49. And the amazing news is you can actually buy the replacement ink for cheaper than that. You can buy the replacement ink at the moment for $44, but that's because it's on special, reduced from $60. And we know the jokes of, people that, it's cheaper to go and buy another printer than buy the ink. Might cost you less now, but the overall cost to the planet of doing that's not particularly good. The same's true in our relationships. It might seem cheaper to just go and get a new church family, a new life of relationships. But the cost to the planet, the cost to us in the long run, is probably worse. So I want to use a familiar story from the Bible in a slightly different way today to explore these responsibilities, this cost. From Luke 15, the story of the lost son. It shows us these 4 things that ruin family relationships, and also shows us the 4 things that restore family relationships. There was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him into his field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother's come home,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' But the older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours,' doesn't even call him his brother, 'this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" This family story shows those things that ruin relationships: selfishness, pride, resentment and disappointment. But it also shows those things that restore: selflessness, humility, forgiveness, and devotion. It's pretty easy in the story to perhaps identify the selfishness. "Father, give me my share. Give me my." It's one of the problems in any family, and one of the problems in the church family is when we start out with the "give me my," I want my, when do I get my? As we read in the book of James, "What causes fights and quarrels? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You want something, but you don't get it." Selfishness often causes fights. The desires within us, they battle within us, and that battle comes out of us into an aggression and a conflict, often with others, with this selfish motivation. And this selfishness leads to something else. You see how this verse ends, and this really is foundational to so much of relationship problems. You want something, but you don't get it. Disappointment. You know, the son in this story ended up getting a bit disappointed. He had great expectations of his life with his inheritance, but that didn't measure up. He probably felt angry at himself for his foolishness, but perhaps at what seemed unfair of how the world turned out. But there are other disappointments in this. I mean, the unmet expectations that you might have of what is going to happen or what someone else is going to do follow on from disappointment and become a huge source of friction. Friction in marriages, friction in friendships, friction in workplaces, and especially in the life of a church, unmet expectations. Maybe we're not particularly selfish, but we still end up in a place of disappointment because we had an expectation and it fell apart. We were let down. And then the disappointment becomes resentment. And the older brother certainly experienced resentment when maybe some of his expectations that there would be some equity and fairness of what was going on between, sons and father, and he ended up with quite a bit of resentment that didn't just leave his relationship with his brother broken, it threatened the relationship he had with his father. The older brother became angry and refused to go in, but the father knew how to behave. He demonstrated his own selflessness, his humility, and his devotion. The things that restore our relationships begin with selflessness. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. To repair broken relationships, including in the church family, it would be good for us to be able to start with selflessness. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. The Bible uses quite strong language. This idea of generosity towards others. It even talks in places about consider others more important than yourself. More important than ourselves. That undoes the where do I get mine and becomes a how do I help you get yours? What you need. And it's a big one, this idea of being able to be selfless and generous in the life of the church family. I have over many years heard things like, well, I don't have kids, so why should I help in youth or kids' church? Or I've done it, I've done my share, should I be still doing my share? Or, my interest really is I want the quality of the coffee to be better. I'm not looking at anyone in particular. I'm not a coffee drinker, so it doesn't matter. But being generous. And there's a difference between a generous act and being generous. The difference is consistency. A generous act doesn't actually make a generous person. We need to have generous spirits, generous hearts. Feel that you're part of this team, part of this church family. This might be in your interest, but what's in the interests of others? That you can be generous towards them. The father in this story was certainly selfless and generous. And to go with that, there was a humility. He was the father after all. All the wealth was sort of his, built up through whatever he had done, yet he was generous with it and he was humble. Humble enough that when the son, who had treated him pretty badly, demanding his share, going off and being pretty foolish with it, started to come back, he's humble enough to run down the road and throw himself around the neck of this son who's returned. Philippians says this, don't be selfish, Don't live to make a good impression on others, but be humble, thinking of others as better than yourself. Don't think only about your own affairs, but be interested in others too and what they're doing. Your attitude should be the same that Jesus Christ had. Though he was God, he did not demand and cling to his rights as God. A humility. We should be humble as the first son became humble, but sadly only after some fairly serious stuff had gone on. We should be humble to ask for forgiveness. But you know, even if it's not us that needs to ask for forgiveness, we can still, out of our own humility, offer to forgive. Both sons needed forgiveness from their father. And what we see is that the father actually lived out of a forgiving spirit to both of them. The father didn't let disappointment in the behaviour of the older son or the behaviour of the younger son become resentment. He didn't let his own pride grow because he remained devoted to both of his sons. Undeserved generosity, unasked for forgiveness. I mentioned before that one of the big problems is when, disappointment ends up leading to resentment because there's a great mismatch in the expectations. And when people get disappointed, we sometimes make an inner vow that we don't want to be disappointed again. So we maybe place ourselves in a situation where we will only ever have low expectations of other people, or we might decide that we're going to have no expectations of them and we'll just be off on our own because we don't want to be in the position of being let down again. But the antidote to disappointment and unmet expectations isn't to have no or low expectations. The Bible doesn't say it, but I'd be surprised if the father wasn't really disappointed in this son, in a way. In the years after he'd gone, he might have had hopes and dreams for how it might pan out, what things would be like. And that was shattered by this son coming, demanding his stuff and going off to a foreign land. There's no doubt in my mind that the father was hurt. But he didn't respond by letting the disappointment fester until it became resentment. And he didn't do it by tossing out any of his expectations. Something that we talk about sometimes in leadership training in church situations and in consulting with churches about leadership is something that is called a gaps and overlaps analysis. And it's to do with expectations and the sources of disappointments and stress and resentment and of conflict. And you might have two individual people or two groups of people, and there's all these different tasks, and everybody has different expectations about those tasks or how that relationship's going to be. And when my expectation and Robin's expectation meet, that's really good. But if you have a certain expectation about who's going to do whatever chores or jobs, and someone else has an expectation that doesn't meet, and there's a gap of this stuff that's not being done and no one's expectations are really being met, there's a lot of room for disappointment there. Stress because it needed to be done and it's not been done, but disappointment because it's not been done, and resentment because you didn't do what you should have been doing. And then there might be a problem where there's certain things, often privileges or things people want, where maybe it's, well, no, I'm the one who gets to choose that. No, I'm the one who gets to choose that. And there's an overlap in the expectations. And that's not managed well. That's where you'll have a conflict. But so one thing that restores relationships, and this one isn't particularly clear in the story, is to manage expectations. To talk about what you expect up front, or when you find there's conflicts or stresses, to try and get to a point where you can, make those expectations mesh just that little bit better. And that takes some devotion to the relationship. You can't just walk away from it and have the conflict or feel disappointed. You've got to be devoted to trying to work it out. And the father in this story was devoted enough to his son to accept him back, to rush to show love to him. And he was devoted to his other son as well, in that when he found out that he was angry and didn't come in, he went out to him. This father goes out to both these sons. Romans 12 is a great chapter, but just this one little verse lifted out of it. Be devoted to one another in love. Not feel love towards one another. Because love, as the emotional experience we have of feelings, can be fleeting, can be damaged by the hurt, the disappointment, the resentment. But being devoted to one another in love. Being devoted. We think love and devotion mean the same thing, but devotion is the commitment that demonstrates and expresses our love regardless of whether the other person satisfies our standards. So these things that ruin relationships as a church family, both here in the congregation and the wider church family as a whole, are selfishness, disappointment, resentment, and pride. But the things that restore are a selflessness, a willing to forgive, a humility, and a devotion to one another. You know, the father didn't have to think about it when the son came home. He didn't have to sit there and debate with himself, oh, here he comes, will I go, will I not go, what will I do, how will I react? Because he'd already, in a way, decided. He already had the love and devotion. So when the son returned, what was already true in the father's heart just got the opportunity to express itself in real actions. In our lives as followers of Jesus, we will hurt each other. In any family, we will hurt each other. We will let each other down. We will both be disappointing and disappointed. We will battle with selfishness and with pride. But if we live as the father in this story did, those things won't be what shapes our life and witness. Devoted to one another, living humbly, running towards with acceptance and forgiveness. In our small group, we've been looking at 1 John lately. If someone says, I love God, but hates a Christian brother or sister, that's a word I said before, the adelphidos. That person is a liar, for if we don't love people we can see, how can we love God whom we've not seen? And God himself has commanded that we must love not only him, but our Christian brothers and sisters too. Be devoted in brotherly love, your translation, if it's an older one, might say. Don't claim to love God, but harbour bitterness or offence. Because fellowship, being a family, begins with being together and sharing together, finishes with loving together. And what's love? Love is patient, love is kind, does not envy, it does not boast, it's not proud, it's not rude, it's not self-seeking, it's not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. And we can use this as a bit of a self-assessment tool. Is Chris patient? Is Chris kind? Does Chris not envy? Does Chris not boast? Is Chris not proud? On we can go, asking perhaps these questions of ourselves. To act kindly and not be rude or self-seeking, we might think they're all right, but then it gets harder not to be easily angered, to keep no record of wrongs. Now, if you just come to the same place at the same time, like that bunch in the, chapel down at Port Arthur, it would be a bit harder maybe to be offended with each other, or at least during the service. But as true members, we are knit together. And so if those offences take root, they spread more easily and make the whole family, the whole body, which is one of the other analogies we'll look at some stage, sick and unwell. We're given some more advice on how to live as God's family. Since God chose you to be the holy people whom he loves, another way of describing the church, You must clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. You must make allowance for each other's faults and forgive the person who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. And the most important piece of clothing you must wear is love. Love is what binds us all together in perfect harmony. When you get up in the morning, when you get out of the shower, you make some deliberate choices and actions to clothe yourself. We have to be intentional about clothing ourselves with those things, so perhaps it's good for us to get in the habit of being intentional, clothing ourselves in these things. Perhaps saying some short prayers during the day, asking God to grant me mercy. God, make me kind. God, help me to be more gentle, more patient. There's responsibility in being the church. Is there any encouragement from belonging to Christ? Any comfort from his love? Any fellowship together in the Spirit? Are your hearts tender and sympathetic? Then make me truly happy by agreeing wholeheartedly with each other, loving one another and working together with one heart and one purpose. Behold what manner of love the Father's given us, that we would be called the children of God. Let me pray. Oh Lord, you want us in